sea. So estuaries are highly productive ecosystems and provide a number of important ecological functions that yield significant benefits to people. They are, however, sensitive to human impacts. This chapter details the proposed integrated and improved management of estuaries in South Africa by means of the National Estuarine Management Protocol, as well as the individual management plans for individual estuaries. So here I'm going to try and give you sort of like an estuarine management protocol for the Tugela as an example. You see in the next coming slides. So estuaries in South Africa must be managed in a coordinated and efficient way in accordance with the National Estuarine Management Protocol, which must be developed by the Minister in conjunction with the Minister responsible for water affairs within 4 years of commencement of the ICM Act. Summary of the National Estuarine Management Protocol requirements as well as estuarine management plans are shown below. So this is a user-friendly guide to the Integrated Coastal Management Act of South Africa. This is the ICM Act. So it's an interesting read. So you need to read it for you to be able to understand how these coastal environments are managed within the country. So what is the purpose of the National Estuarine Management Protocol? So it aims to determine the strategic visions and objectives for achieving effective integrated management of estuaries. Then it sets standards and guidelines for estuarine management. And then it defines how management responsibilities must be carried out by organs of state and others. And then it aims to establish the minimum requirements and identify people responsible for preparation of estuarine management plans and the process to be followed. So they also aim to specify a review process for estuarine management plans to ensure compliance with the Integrated Coastal Management Act and to publish the protocol for public comment as determined in Section 53 of Chapter 6 of the Act. So these are the different purposes of the National Estuarine Management Protocol. So what are the requirements for the estuarine management plans? Consistency with the National Estuarine Management Protocol, consistency with the National Coastal Management Program, consistency with applicable provincial coastal management program, then consistency with applicable municipal coastal management program, then publication of a plan for public comment as determined in Part 6 of Chapter 6. So designated estuarine management authorities as specified by the National Estuarine Management Protocol should be responsible for both the development and implementation of the plan. So they are generic frameworks for the determination of and implementation of estuarine management plans. So situation assessment, it provides a description of the biological, physical and social aspects of the estuary and a review of management, use and conservation scenarios. And then you have the management plan, which provides details of the plan, including the vision, the strategic objectives, management strategy, zonation plan, and management action. So this is just an overview trying to highlight how estuaries should be managed. So looking at the Tugela estuarine management plan, all right. So this was developed in 2014, all right. So there were several people that were involved, and one of the person you might know him is Dr. Gordon O'Brien. who's currently a senior lecturer at UMP. So he was still affiliated with the Institute for Natural Resources. So they developed the Tugela Estuarine Management Plan. So he worked in conjunction with several organizations in coming up with the estuarine management plans. So if you look at the Tugela Estuarine Management Plan as part of the Integrated Coastal Management Act number 24 of 2008. So estuary management plans for each estuary in South Africa must be established. That's why they came up with this management plan for the Tugela, because each and every estuary is supposed to have its management plans. So within the context of estuarine management plans, so management refers to a continuous and dynamic process that unites all sectors of society in preparing and implementing an integrated plan for the protection and development of resources. So the goal of management is sustainable development, which takes into account social, economic, and environmental needs of both current and future generations. So Van Niekerk et al. Has done a lot of the estuarine management plans, especially for the cool temperate and the warm temperate estuaries, together with Janine Adams at Nelson Mandela. So Van Niekerk works for the Center for Scientific and Industrial Research. I think he works for CSIR. So part 1 and part 2 of the Tugela estuarine management plans. So part 1 covers the situation assessment. You remember, situation assessment now looks at the biological, physical, social aspects of the estuary and a review of the management, use and conservation scenarios. Then part 2, the management plan, the action plan. It covers details including the vision, strategic objectives, management strategy, zonation plan, and management actions. So I think let's end there, and then I'll come and sort of like continue with the Tugela estuarine management plan.
In today's presentation, we're going to look at an overview of the legislation that applies to estuary management in South Africa. First, we're going to look at an overview of South Africa's legal framework. Then I'm going to share with you the complexity of our national coastal legislation, which also applies to estuaries. And then from that, we're going to look at the key legislation that's relevant to estuary management. And finally, I'm going to share with you some ideas on the institutional structures that has been put up for the implementation of legal mandates and the forums where this could be coordinated and collaborated. So if we look at the structure of South Africa's legal framework, at the top is our constitution. Under that, we've got a national legislation that includes our national policies, which are the white papers, and then an array of national acts. We also have at the provincial level, provincial legislation or provincial acts. And in terms of estuaries, those mostly deal with land use planning and conservation. And then finally, at the local level, we also have various municipal bylaws. And they, in terms of estuaries, would deal specifically with land use planning, but also development in the coastal environment. The focus of today's presentation will, however, be on the national legislation. So if we look at the national legislation that applies to the coast, it really turns out to be an arendagram. First, there's different sectors that operate in this space. Then there's quite an array of international conventions and agreements that apply to this space. From there, we've developed almost 46, almost 50 national acts and refinements of those acts in terms of regulations, protocols, policies, and guidelines. We've published a paper on this in Ocean and Coastal Management, so if you want to read more, you're welcome to go to the paper. So from that rendergram, if we look at key legislation relevant to estuary management, we can broadly group it into legislation that deals with estuarine resource planning and protection, legislation that deals with the management of activities and uses in and around estuaries, and then finally legislation that enables integration in estuarine management. So if we look at estuarine resource planning and protection, this is typically legislation that sets site-specific objectives or targets for estuarine resources, either for the specific parameters, biodiversity targets, or fisheries targets. And in South Africa, these are probably the key legislation in this category. So in terms of water resource protection, it's the Water Act. In terms of biodiversity protection, it's the Biodiversity Act, protected areas, and then the Marine Living Resources Act dealing with fisheries, and two acts, the World Heritage Convention Act and the National Heritage Resource Act, that deals with heritage area, the protection of heritage areas. So just to delve a bit deeper into some of these acts, when we look at the National Water Act, this is the act that gives right to water for the protection of aquatic ecosystem functioning for a list of water resources, of which estuaries is one. Now specifically Chapter 8 in this act deals with classification. And basically what that entails is that each water resource in the country must be allocated a class. So to have an idea of what level do you want to manage it at. And this is where the Estuarine Health Index with its classes A to F would link in. Then once a class has been allocated, it's important to set what the Act refers to as the reserve, which is the water volume required for the water resource, as well as the quality of river inflow in the case of estuaries. And then finally, the Act requires that one sets measurable resource quality objectives for the habitat and the biota. So it needs to be set in a way that one can monitor it and that one can check. So if it's for water quality, it needs to be set in terms of specific water quality measurements. If we look at the Biodiversity Act, its main purpose is to plan and set targets for biodiversity and conservation, and it includes estuaries. It's also under this act that we do the National Biodiversity Assessment, or that SANBI is required to do the National Biodiversity Assessment every 5 years, as they are mandated to assess and monitor the state's biodiversity. In terms of the Protected Areas Act, that's the act where under marine protected areas are promulgated. And you'll remember in 2019, 20 new marine protected areas were given legal protection. And it was quite a mission for SANBI to achieve that. Some of these include estuaries, although there's still very little estuarine area in legally protected areas, and it's something that we need to work on. In terms of the Marine Living Resources Act, it's mandated to protect our marine living resources, and in terms of this category, it declares, for example, closed areas where It either prohibits you to exploit living resources or it requires you to have permits. And in this figure, it's the pink and the red areas that's relevant or show where closed areas have been declared. So if we look at the legislation around the management of activities and uses, these can roughly be divided in water quantity and quality, land use infrastructure, and the exploitation of living resources. So if we look at water quantity and quality, you'll see there's quite a number of acts that's relevant. In terms of water abstraction, it's the National Water Act. Very interesting in estuaries is that effluent disposal, so wastewater treatment works, if it's disposed of within the estuary functional zone, it's actually legislated under the National Water Act and the ICM Act. So you have to have a permit under the ICM Act and a license under the National Water Act. And this is problematic because there's sometimes confusion about who should drive, and the collaboration here has had problems in the past. What is also important from an estuarian's perspective, and this is something that we actually learned when Tandi gave her presentation, is that there's also a section that deals with water quality in Chapter 8 that deals with pollution spillages. And this is the legislation where, for example, problems with overflowing sewage pump stations or spills in estuary would be dealt with. In terms of dredging and the disposal of dredge spoil in harbour areas, there's also a section under the Integrated Coastal Management Act that deals with that. And solid waste management has got its own act, which is referred to as the Waste Act. Interestingly, the water quality in recreational areas like beaches is mandated under the National Health Act, and that act requires that the metros and district municipalities are responsible for monitoring beach water quality. Then in terms of shipping and harbours, there's quite a range of legislation under the International Convention MARPOL that deals with the prevention of pollution from ships, and this is the most important one in that category. So you'll see from this there's quite a number of national departments down to municipalities that play a role in the management of activities in the water quantity and quality domain. So if we look at land use and infrastructure development, again, you'll see quite an array of legislation being applicable. Coastal access and off-road vehicles falling under the ICM Act, and provincial and municipal authorities looking after that. Then we have a National Ports Act that deal with developments in ports. We have a special act that deal with mining. And then there's a number of acts that address infrastructure and land use, from the Municipal Systems Act to SPLUMA to the Building Regulations Act. And you'll see that even in these, there are different departments that's involved. Another important thing when it comes to the coastal environment is state land, and that is even managed under another piece of legislation by Public Works, both at the national government level but also at the provincial level. Cross-cutting it around these kinds of activities is the EIA regulations under the National Environmental Management Act that sets very specific requirements on what needs to be done in terms of EIAs and when it is required. Specifically to estuaries, anything in the estuary functional zone needs to be EIA is required, and interestingly also mouth breaching falls under this piece of legislation. If we look at the exploitation of living resources, it's mostly the Marine Living Resources Act that looks at setting catch limits for fish bait collection. It also deals with marine aquaculture and interesting also seaweed or kelp collection. So they control that particular act, control that under the Fisheries Department. Mangroves falls under the National Forest Act, and any terrestrial plants or the use of terrestrial plants, for example, that would be in the estuary functional zone, would be controlled under the Conservation of Agricultural Resources Act by Agriculture. So finally, if we look at the legislation that is aimed at enabling integration in estuarine management, it is a challenge, and it was one of the main reasons for the promulgation of the Integrated Coastal Management Act. And this act is very strong in providing or making provision for the establishment of mechanisms to facilitate and integrate. Most specifically, the National Estuary Management Protocol under this Act deals specifically with management requirements for estuaries. And one of the key things that the protocol requires is the implementation of integrated estuarine management plans for each estuaries. And you'll remember that in 2014, now the university and the CSIR assisted the National Environmental Department to develop guidelines to develop these plans for the development and implementation of these plans. The Act, in terms of institutional structures to help us with the integration of legal mandates, the ICM Act requires the establishment of coastal committees, which also addresses estuary management. And in the National Estuary Management Protocol, it also allows the establishment of estuarine advisory forums or bodies. So what we have in South Africa at the moment is that we have a National Coastal Committee that takes the form of Working Group 8, which is a ministerial committee where the national departments that deals with coastal and ocean matters are organized within. Then we have also provincial coastal committees that's been established in the 4 coastal provinces in South Africa. And then we've also, in many municipal areas, we've also got municipal coastal committees. And in many of these, they have set up subcommittees or substructures that specifically gives attention to the estuaries with at the national level, provincial level, or the municipal level. And then finally, what has been established at various local estuarine environments are local advisory bodies. And these used to be the earlier forums that we had in estuaries, and these bodies played a very important role in the early days of integration of management in estuaries, even before the ICM Act came to the fore. So we fought very hard to try and keep these institutions in place, because they are often the eyes and ears on the ground. So thank you. I hope that I could share something useful with you on the legal framework governing estuarine management in South Africa.